I suppose I should begin my talk with a bit of a disclaimer. I will declare that I am, as was mentioned, a political historian in the main. And the brief for this talk was to discuss some kind of aspect of the social history of the revolution and its aftermath. So slightly beyond the usual remit of my own research. This consideration then sort of informed my choice of topic. And I tried to find an area of my research where political and social history could come together, sort of interface between political and social history, which grows, I suppose, from my PhD work and my book that's coming out next year. It led me to think more about an institution that I'd come across when conducting research for my book. This prion there, the government reception, the Soviet government reception. Something that I touched upon lightly in the book, but as I got thinking in what I would prepare for this talk, I thought, yeah, this is worth exploring in a bit more depth. So that's what I'll do. That's the kind of, I think, rationale. I'm going, though, to say that after putting a bit of research together on the topic, I'm going to draw back from making very broad generalizations about social history, about popular opinions and public moods and support for the Bolsheviks, because as I began to explore the sources that I had on this, I noticed that what I can conclude is more about what the state thought it was doing and how it tried to engage with the people rather than actually measure, how far the people were sort of supporting the Bolsheviks or not. So I'm going to sort of draw back from that. But hopefully you'll find it interesting as I talk about how ordinary people, workers and peasants, engage with the state institutions, and I've got hopefully some interesting examples of that for you.
Could you speak up?
Yes. Sorry, I should sort of, is that better? Yeah, good, okay. It's a really interesting time, I think, to explore what I think is what the early Soviet leaders thought they were doing was experimenting with different kinds of strategies for democratizing. I think it's really important now that, allegedly we're in a sort of post-Cold War era. Perhaps you may not be too convinced of that, but the idea that the world was divided into a sort of evil, communist, repressive, totalitarian Soviet Union and a sort of wonderful, good, democratic West. I think this has really kind of overshadowed how we understand the kind of the political structures of the early and the later, of course, Soviet government. So what I tried to do in my book then is to look at the early Soviet democracy as a unique kind of experiment in its own right, not to try and sort of tick off elements that it did or didn't have compared to liberal parliamentary systems, but to try to understand these kind of innovations in techniques and strategies of governing that were intended to democratize, but in the long term actually perhaps built in kinds of dysfunction, sort of unforeseen consequences of these innovations that ultimately led to a sort of the emergence of a kind of monolithic, repressive one-party dictatorship. It got me thinking. I don't know if you're familiar. Well, you're familiar with this chap, I'm sure. Vladimir Putin. And as I got thinking about my government reception, I was reminded of this annual telephone sort of phone-in session, telephone, is that what you call it? That Mr. Putin conducts every year, direct line with Putin. This is how it looked in my imagination, but then actually this is how it looks in real life. He's not actually on the phone. But Putin himself sort of replicates this idea of the central government having a direct line, a personal contact with citizens, and that this shows the government to be in some way kind of open and responsive. So yeah, that's sort of got me thinking. I also think it's perhaps an interesting time to re-examine critiques of Western liberal parliamentary democracy. I think we're living, some of you might agree, we're living in fairly troubled times when it comes to modern kind of parliamentary systems, political parties. There's sort of some of us feeling quite disenchanted and alienated from that kind of politics. And so looking back to see critiques of those kind of systems that were around at the beginning of the 20th century when Lenin and Bolsheviks and other radical socialists were thinking about how to make a better kind of democracy. We might say that perhaps they weren't successful, but it's interesting to explore those kind of early critiques, I think, too. And perhaps the reception was one of these kinds of instruments to attempt to bring about a superior form of democracy that sort of spectacularly failed in the longer term. Let me explain then just a sort of brief background of where I'm coming from then. So my book really talks about the earliest years of Soviet power, just those really exciting early years after the October Revolution, and challenging that kind of fairly old-fashioned now, I think, Communist Party-centric, ideological totalitarian model. What I'm trying to do is look at the early Soviet government as a kind of fluid phase of improvisation, of negotiation, of the meaning of Soviet power and Soviet democracy. That Soviet leaders were experimenting with superior kinds of democracy. Inspired, of course, by Marxist ideas, but not a sort of totalitarian blueprint, as perhaps some scholars of earlier decades may have held. And so the reception then is worth thinking about in these terms, I think.
Sorry, ignore me.
My glamorous assistant is Albert Rees Williams. Some of you may have heard of the American journalist and labour organiser Albert Rees Williams. And he left an account of his visit to the Soviet government reception. This is what he said. Half an hour, he's sitting in the government reception waiting to meet with Lenin at this point. Half an hour and a half, we sat waiting in the reception. The even voice of the visitor carried from the office. Finally, the door of the office opened, and to general surprise, out stepped not a diplomat, nor some other highly positioned person, but a bearded mujik, so a peasant man, in a long sheepskin coat and bast shoes, a typical poor peasant. Lenin apologised for the delay, explaining, "This peasant came from Tambov. I wanted to find out what he thought about electrification, cooperation, and economic policy. He talked about such interesting things that I completely lost track of time." Now, of course, this is written by a left-wing sympathiser towards Lenin. Some of you cynics might be wanting to say to me. But actually, when we look at the kind of archival records, I sort of been amazed at the amount of time that Lenin spent receiving representatives of peasantry and workers, and it got me thinking that there must be some significance in his eyes to doing so. So let me just explain a little bit about the setting up of this reception, this place where ordinary people, workers and peasants, could come and meet with leaders of the Soviet government and their secretaries. They could submit requests and complaints, give information, and expect some kind of response. this is the Smolny Institute. Some of you are probably familiar with this building. This was the kind of headquarters of the early Soviet government in the first months after the revolution, before the move to Moscow in March 1918. And it was in this building that the reception was first established. It's stunning to me, actually, that anybody could apply for a pass, get their documents checked, and stroll into the headquarters of the early Soviet government and meet a representative or a secretary who would take their complaints or requests. Every visitor was supposed to be guaranteed a pass. The pass is very important, though. I think there's some story about sort of Lenin being refused because his papers weren't right at some point. So Russians are good with propust, aren't they? You have to have the right paperwork. But if you did, you got in, no matter who you were, worker, peasant, or anybody else. In Smolny Institute, then, on the sort of second floor, in the first days after the revolution, the Soviet leaders were getting sort of crowds, swarms of people coming just to find out what was going on in the Soviet government. And it was decided that it was necessary to establish a room, a reception room, where workers, soldiers, peasants could attend. They basically shoved some tables and a few chairs that they'd got together to form a sort of desk and a table for kind of registration of visitors and their complaints. And this is going really from the first few days of the October Revolution. They have one sort of red guard standing at the door. It's all fairly lax security these days. It's quite stunning. From the very first days, then, those people around Lenin supporting the running of the early Soviet government, in particular a chap called Vladimir Bruyevich, who was head of the Soviet government administration department, recalled that huge quantities of letters, petitions, requests, as well as visits from delegations, deputation envoys. And he wrote that power was poorly organised in the localities, it was difficult to survive, and people were drawn to the centre, to the central power, wishing to gain answers to hundreds of essential questions. He writes, the peasants, of course, had most questions at all. Power was often interpreted very differently than in the centre. The Sovnarkom reception then was open daily from noon. Yeah, you could turn up. The secretaries would listen to your requests. They would try to fit you in with a state representative, perhaps Lenin if you were very lucky indeed. And peasants began to appear in their droves in the reception. They demanded resolution of land needs. Land is their sort of most important overriding kind of issue that they're interested in, and they come up and they want solution of land disputes, requisitioning of farm produce. They would come and complain about that quite a lot. And after the day's work, all of the staff were to produce sort of summaries of all of these requests and petitions, and Lenin would read these after he'd finished his work for the day. Lenin had a special day. Fridays was the day that Lenin would meet representatives of the people and sort of personally take them into his office. And even after the Soviet government moved to the Kremlin, you can see him here, this practice very much continued and only expanded. Every commissariat, so every sort of ministry of the Soviet government, had to have its own reception. So this is not just the central government sort of cabinet that has its own, but every single commissariat from 1918, really early 1918, are instructed to have some kind of place that would receive workers, peasants and soldiers. And what struck me is it's really interesting, this issue of place, of kind of geography and of public accessibility of the government buildings. It got me thinking about Lenin's pamphlet, I suppose it is, State and Revolution, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And in this pamphlet, Lenin, of course, rejects kind of parliamentary democracy as a kind of sham. It's a system where the working classes choose representatives who are going to repress them for another 3 years. But there's a really interesting quotation that talked about, let me see if I can find it for you, place. And I think what the early Soviet leaders thought they were doing in opening up government buildings to the people so that people could visit, could occupy them. So Lenin writes in State and Revolution, democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich, that is, the democracy of capitalist society. If we look more closely into the machinery of capitalist democracy, we see everywhere in the petty, supposedly petty details of suffrage, residential qualifications, exclusion of women, etc., in the technique of representative institutions, in the actual obstacles to the right of assembly. Public buildings are not for paupers. So even in State and Revolution, he's critiquing this idea that government buildings are beyond the kind of access of ordinary people. And perhaps we see a response to this in the creation of these public places where workers, peasants, soldiers could visit. And again, sort of later on, he's talking about government representatives who have never been in close contact with the oppressed classes. So he's interested in kind of the space, the accessibility. This is one of the problems, as he sees it, with parliamentary systems in Western Europe. So, volumes of visitors then. Now, again, the sources, of course, are difficult on this. In terms of numbers, it's very difficult to say precisely. The head of the administration department who is running the show tells us in his memoir that they received 6,000 people, each of whom represented a large group of the population in 6 months. So 1,000 people a month. Sounds quite a lot there. I'm not sure how they would quite manage that. But again, from various memoirs and accounts of those working in the Soviet government, it's basically thousands and thousands of people. I'm fairly convinced that this is the impression. Now, whether you think that's a significant number when the population is, I don't know, 120 million or something, it is up to you. But there's certainly an uptake for this kind of practice going on. And it very much continues throughout the Soviet era under Lenin, for example, who becomes the sort of figurehead of the Soviet state, and not the actual leader, but the figurehead from the late 20s onwards. So the numbers are there. One of the things that I found really interesting was that peasants seem to be drawn to this kind of personal experience with the Soviet authorities. And it's sort of building upon that traditional, perhaps imperial Russian political culture of this sort of Batyushka myth, this sort of idea of the Tsar as the father of the people, and the sort of wicked people in the middle are the sort of, nobles, and they feel that they have this sort of special personal connection with the leaders at the top. So there's a sort of, perhaps a Tsar-shaped hole in the peasants' understanding, and they come to kind of embrace this personal visiting of the reception or of sending petitions. I found some really interesting accounts of peasant visits and this sense of kind of ritual that the peasants brought with them when they were meeting with representatives of the Soviet government in the reception. So I have a quotation here which gives you a sort of flavour of that. Maria Skripnik, who again was one of the secretaries of the reception, recalled that despite all persuasion, peasant delegates did not want to return to the localities without having seen Lenin. Some, after visiting the reception, asked the secretary to give them a note. In this note, they demanded to write that so-and-so had really been received by Lenin. Very often we had to issue such papers. The peasant envoys took these documents and, like a sacred object, carefully placed it to their bosom, having wrapped it in a clean rag. Peasant envoys, having seen Lenin and heard his advice, were then considered the first person in the village. So there's something, I think, interesting perhaps going on here in how peasants are relating to the Soviet state. And in a sense, they're almost driving the response of the Soviet authorities. So from the early days, it's the people kind of turning up in person, writing to the state is receiving them, and it's sort of emerging in this way as a sort of particular strategy or practice of the government. It's not only in person, so if you were illiterate, you could turn up in person, somebody would write down your question, your complaint, and you would be due an answer within a reasonable time. But people sent letters too. There's a whole archival fund, a huge file full of thousands and thousands of these letters that I came across when I was researching the Council of People's Commissars, basically the Soviet government cabinet in the early years of the revolution. There's quite a lot of hate mail too, so it's not all nice, and it's all in handwriting, a lot of it, which is terrible if you're a historian that uses archival sources. Handwriting is just the worst. So it's taken me quite a lot of time to get through just a few of these. But yeah, again, we have some fairly reliable numbers of letter petitions sent to the Soviet government reception. So in the fortnight beginning 23rd November 1917, the Soviet, basically the reception, the administration department, received more than 1,700 different pieces of correspondence, 9,000 between January and November 1921. So again, kind of thousands and thousands, over 1,000 per month. And there's a kind of breakdown there, varied requests and complaints on the activities of the local power, applications for help, lots of stuff about taking of property, the food tax, and land questions. What does all this mean then? You're probably thinking, when I sort of pulled Putin up at the beginning, you're thinking, well, this is not a generally democratizing kind of strategy. This is this kind of disingenuous, cynical posturing, trying to appear as open and responsive. But what kind of democracy is it if only the people that call up the president get stuff done for them? Yeah, it's not a kind of fair system going on there, is it? And perhaps that is the case. Perhaps this is simply that. Perhaps it's a sort of propaganda purposes of the state. And that was my first impression. But as I began to read more, and particularly the kind of interdepartmental correspondence inside the Soviet government, I started to think maybe there's actually something more to this. Again, the amount of time and energy that Lenin devoted to very minor sort of problems of, have you replied to the letter from this peasant? Have you given him a solution to this? It seems to me that maybe something more interesting is going on, at least in the intentions of the Soviet state. So let me give you an example then. In January 1920, the peasant V. Yushin from a village called Osht in Olenetsk gubernia sent a telegram to Sobnakon, to the Soviet government reception. He complained in this telegram that local powers had taken, as part of Razbyestka, one of his 3 cows. He was very upset about this situation. His family consisted of 9 people, and one son was a Red Army soldier. So in his opinion, this was not okay. Yeah, they should not have taken one of his 3 cows. Brychkina, who is a secretary in the Sovnarkom reception, sent a copy of this telegram to the People's Commissariat, so the Ministry of Foodstuffs. She failed, though, to trace the reply sent to this peasant, and then had instructed that all replies must be followed up, and he wanted to know that everything was taken care of. She hadn't done this, and when Lenin found out, he writes her a note, a really nasty note, actually, to Brychkina. This is impossible. It is not enough just to send this request to the Commissariat of Foodstuffs, to recuse the Commissar. It's necessary to check and to note what answer was sent and when. And I just saw this again and again, and I sort of wondered, why is he so interested in what seemed to us perhaps like very minor sort of issues? And as I read a bit more, I sort of heard the same sort of theme cropping up again and again when Lenin is reprimanding members of his staff in the government. He suggests, and in his own words, that the reception is a form of living link. It's жизненное in Russian. It's a living link to the people. It's an important strategy of Soviet democracy that links state and society, that makes this an open and responsive kind of regime. And when people failed to respond to these, what you might think are sort of minor complaints and petitions, Lenin remarked, "Our own bureaucrats are already bureaucratized to such a degree that they are dissatisfied by the population, by whom they govern, try on behalf of their needs to lodge complaints and requests. We created the state apparatus really for this purpose." I think that's a really interesting final line there. So his view of the state apparatus there, it's quite interesting. Again, I have lots of more cross letters from Lenin explaining sort of what he thought the purpose of this reception was. He writes again in December of 21, "Once and for all, it's necessary to put an end to the outreach of red tape and kancelyarshin, as a sort of bureaucratism in your institutions. Important and urgent tasks sent to you by the Sovnarkom reception in solving numerous complaints remain completely unanswered and fulfilled. I propose to pull together the machine of Soviet administration immediately to work accurately, precisely, and quickly. From its slackness, not only do the interests of individual people suffer, but the whole business of administration takes on a sham, illusory character." So in his opinion then, the business of administration was to respond in some sense to these requests and petitions. Again, December 21, he's writing, and this is the kind of the living link which I use for my title. "From the work of the reception in handling complaints and statements, it's clear that especially serious and urgent cases have demonstrated the usefulness of the reception as a living connection." Again, he goes back to this in 1921-22 and reaffirms the reception room. So this is not a sort of passing fancy just of 1917, 1918, but he's reimposing this in the later stages of the Russian Civil War. So this living link then, this close link, we can see how Lenin envisages this working, this link, as he sees it, between state and people. Lenin had received a visit at the reception from a particular peasant, again another peasant we know as Sergei Frolov, and he writes a note to another government department asking for assistance to this particular peasant to buy or receive bread for his village in Samar Gubernia. And you see, I guess, the really interesting, again, this kind of ritualized response from the peasant The peasant reply is at the bottom, so the peasant writes back to Lenin when they get home and they get their complaint seen to. And they write to him, "We, those authorised, returning home to Samara Gubernia, attest that in the centre really does offer special care to overcome hunger and calamity, that our great leader Lenin took close to his heart all the needs of the suffering peasantry." Now again, of course, you need to take this with a pinch of salt. This is a very kind of formulaic, ritualized kind of response. It's the kind of thing that you would see in petitions to the Tsar before 1917. But it's interesting that there's this kind of echo of pre-revolutionary political culture that the Bolsheviks are sort of unconsciously perhaps engaging with. They think that they're opening up a reception as a sort of anti-liberal parliamentary system kind of strategy, and they're doing something new that will make their government open and responsive. But in doing so, they're sort of unconsciously replicating the kind of paternal, top-down, personalised, manual control kind of political culture of the Tsarist era. I think it's great. There you go, conclusions, 5 minutes. Fairly well. So then, the formulaic nature of this, of the petitions, many of the letters that I read, and these kind of responses, I think, show that this practice, of course, transcends regime change. The Bolsheviks aren't working in a vacuum. They're working in a pre-existing society, in a pre-existing political culture. And workers and peasants in particular seem to have an understanding of how they should relate to state authorities. And in some senses, this is shaping what the state is doing, as well as, the ideology that they think is shaping what the state is doing, if that makes sense. The peasants and workers, they know how to play this game. Yeah, they understand this personalised kind of comprehension of power and a kind of patrimonial, sort of patriarchal culture. They understood that they could go to the head Bolshevik, as they had done to the Tsar, and appeal for help. It's amazing to me that in all of the documents that I read, and all of the memoirs, and all of the accounts, there's absolutely no self-awareness from the Soviet leaders that they were, in any sense, replicating this practice. And that really surprised me. I mean, I don't know how they managed to overlook that. Perhaps it's just not something that they would want to consciously acknowledge. When they discuss this in their sort of private and public writings, it's justified as explained on a kind of ideological basis. It's explained as a new, unique strategy for de-bureaucratizing the state apparatus, for making a better, superior form of democracy. It's not seen as a carryover from the Tsarist regime. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that in the example of the reception, where we see state and society coming together, we see how perhaps the deeply ingrained political culture existing already in the Russian Empire helps to shape the institutional choices. The peasants, the workers, come to the early organs of Soviet power and they ask particular things, and the government responds. And we see this in lots of accounts of setting up of commissariats. Alexandra Kollontai is setting up a commissariat of social welfare. You can read her memoir, and she explains that actually it's people coming to her, workers and peasants coming to her and asking for, that's their first business. We see this in other memoirs. Ilyin Zhenevsky, memoirs of a Red Guard, is kind of expressing this similar kind of theme. What I'm saying then is that this kind of communion with the people has been a long-standing, whether it's Tsars, whether it's Lenin, whether it's Stalin, whether it's Putin. the most cynical of you might say that this is a sort of, again, a disingenuous kind of excuse. They don't have to find truly kind of representative solutions, kind of electoral kind of structures, that sort of thing. And perhaps that is the case. And this is still very much a sort of work in progress. So I'm very interested to hear whether you think I'm completely sort of naive, or whether there's something interesting worth talking about here. Yeah, I think I've probably run out of time, so I should probably stop talking at you. But yeah, I'm inclined to think that at least the Soviet leaders think, their intentions are positive at this stage in terms of democratizing. This did not actually work out in practice, as we all know. But should we look at that in kind of hindsight, or should we look at, in that moment of October as an alternative, experimental, democratic strategy? Let me know what you think. Experimental.